evening, and welcome to the 32nd Legislative District Virtual Town Hall. Tonight, you'll be hearing from State Representatives Cindy Ryu and Lauren Davis. Some of you have submitted questions in advance, and I will read those questions to the lawmakers. You may also submit your question live via the comment section, so please submit your questions now, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Before we begin answering questions, I'd like to open up the floor to our lawmakers for some opening remarks. We'll begin with Representative Ryu. Rep Ryu, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Ryu, representing the great people of the 32nd Legislative District, along with Representative Davis. Just as a brief introduction, I do chair the Innovation Committee and Economic Development and Veterans Committee, and I also serve on Consumer Protection and Business Committee, as well as Appropriations Committee with Representative Davis. Representative Davis?
Good evening, everyone. Lauren Davis, very glad to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for joining. I serve, as Rep. Ryu mentioned, on the Appropriations, so the House Budget Committee. I also serve on the Healthcare Committee and the House Community Safety Committee.
The bills that I introduced, there's a couple of them that are progressing. House Bill 1997, which is a State Parks and Recreation Commission appointment of diverse experiences, people of diverse experiences, backgrounds, gender, and geography. We've been actually practicing this, and so for the first time ever, we finally have a female parks director. And so we will continue to pay a lot more attention to not only people of diverse backgrounds getting outdoors, but also being in the profession of leading in the outdoors. Another bill that is progressing, which I have been working on for at least 3 years now, the House actually unanimously passed the House Bill 2153, which is Catalytic Converter Thefts Bill. And I believe it is going to be one of the foundational pillars of increasing public safety as well as protecting consumers. I believe Representative Davis has more bills than I that's moving on. Is that correct?
I think a similar amount. I have legislation related to substance use disorder treatment, so trying to make it easier for individuals to enter into inpatient addiction treatment and then also to stay in inpatient addiction treatment. So trying to eradicate some of the insurance barriers that make it difficult for people to get into care and stay in care, and also to address an issue with addiction treatment providers who actually kick people out of treatment inappropriately. Another piece of legislation I've been working on that's now in the Senate, it relates to high-potency cannabis and trying to address some of the public health harms associated with high THC products, namely psychosis and psychotic disorder. And then finally, I have legislation also in the Senate now related to first responder wellness, so ensuring that we provide mental health and addiction supports for our law enforcement officers, firefighters, corrections officers, EMS, dispatchers, etc.
Which, of course, I supported all of them. So good bills, Representative Davis. We introduced a lot more bills than those. The ones that did not move ahead, but which I will be working on during the interim for the 2025 session, includes House Bill 2057, which is incarcerated veterans. Every year, about 140 or so veterans who are incarcerated are released into society after paying for their crimes. Fortunately, Edmonds College has a program that connects with them at least, I believe, 6 months before they're released. And so they are getting the help they need to make sure that they continue education as well as access, housing, and so on. So I wanted to make sure that program continues and hopefully even expand. So I'm looking forward to working on that. A second one is one I've been working on for about 7 years, which is permanent cosmetics artists licensing. I think we finally have the formula right. And Department of Licensing representative just told me this morning, we might be able to save $1 million from the fiscal note, is what we call it. So I'm really looking forward to fine-tuning it for the next year The most expensive bill that I ever worked on, the fiscal note was $32 million for a statewide aerial imagery program that the assessors wanted us to adopt. And that's every 2 years. We think we can skinny it down to $15 million every 2 years. So I'll keep working on that. And the last one is much more local. We used to represent St. Edward Park in Kenmore. And fortunately, we got a private partner because the seminary building was basically falling into disrepair, and we didn't have the money during the Great Recession to refurbish it or even to keep it from falling in. And so a private entity stepped up, and we made an exception for them to have a 60+ year lease so that they could qualify for financing and so on. Unfortunately, in the meantime, every other lessee got 80 years except them. And now, especially recovering from COVID, they need that extra 20 years or so. That bill did not pass, but I'll keep working on that. How about you, Representative Davis?
Sure. Well, I think every time I'm during session, I keep adding things to an interim list, and I think I have not hyperbole. I think I have 50 items on there, so I'll have to figure out which ones are the priority. But a couple that I'll mention that will be continued from this year. One has to do with civil commitment or involuntary treatment, which is our state's provision for getting help for individuals who are too sick and unwilling or unable to get help for themselves because of either mental health or substance use disorder challenges. Also, legislation related to housing for domestic violence survivors, both in the capital budget, so providing funding to actually purchase units for DV survivors and their children who need immediate shelter because they're fleeing. Our domestic violence shelters in this state, virtually all of them are full every night. And so survivors who are in grave danger have nowhere to go. And then also looking at housing vouchers. We have many housing voucher programs in this state for all sorts of populations, people with mental health challenges, people with substance use disorder, people with developmental disabilities, but we don't have any housing voucher programs for survivors of domestic violence. And so working on creating that as well.
Great. Thank you both so much for that introduction. Just as a reminder, you're watching a live virtual town hall with your 32nd district representatives, and you can submit questions in the comment section. We're going to get started with a question about balanced billing on an ambulance rides. Here we go.
So, so question about from a mom about her son. I think folks can see that on the screen, but in case anybody is visually impaired, it was balance billed or kind of what we call surprise billing for an ambulance ride, and it can be incredibly expensive. The Washington State actually really took the lead on this concept of surprise billing, which is basically when you get an extraordinary bill that you didn't expect because something was considered sort of out of network from an insurance perspective. And Washington State actually passed legislation about this before the federal government did. We passed a bill in 2019 and the federal government passed legislation in 2020 to address that. And then we came back in 2022 and worked to strengthen the language. But the one thing that was left out of that, so it's now the practice of these sort of surprise bills from insurance are now prohibited in Washington State and largely federally, with the exception of ground ambulance transport. So there is legislation this year, Senate Bill 5986, which we actually had a hearing today in the House Healthcare Committee on which I serve, that would end the practice of balance billing or surprise billing for ambulance transports. I, just like the mom who submitted this, I also had that experience with my grandmother who was, we got a huge bill for her ambulance ride she broke her hip and going from the hospital to skilled nursing. And so I'm keenly interested in this, and that bill passed the Senate unanimously, and we had a favorable discussion and hearing today in the House Healthcare Committee, so I do expect that to move.
And my personal experience was that after a car accident where I was rear-ended, I went to the emergency room. Everybody billed my insurance PIP coverage. And then 6 months later, I got a collection notice, or a collection call, actually. And I said, I never saw the ambulance bill. Why did you send it to the collection agency? And so I basically was able to fight it, I guess, and had them, because I was an insurance agent for 24 years, so I knew how this worked. And I used to also do Medicaid intake at University Hospital. And so I was able to get the penalties and late fees removed. But I could imagine anyone who was surprised in that way, that you never even saw the bill, even if you did, that surprise billing of excess charges that supposedly, according to the insurance companies, you're not supposed to pay, and yet you're being billed for it and being sent to the collection agency. And so I'm looking forward to seeing that bill and see if we can also, because when I was asking the questions, neither Department of Health or the Office of the Insurance Commissioner had any say or oversight over ambulance bills. So I'm looking forward to hearing that bill, probably most likely in appropriations or maybe even on the floor. So I'm glad you're serving on Healthcare Committee, Representative Davis.
Great. Thank you both for those responses. Our next question, I believe, is about Rep. Ryu's catalytic converter bill. And thank you, Rep. Davis, for pointing out those who potentially are visually impaired and don't actually see the question. So I am going to fully read them out. What are the opponents of House Bill 2153 saying about why they are not supporting it?
Well, last year I could not get a bill even, I think I introduced it, but I could not get it tight enough for it to be moved out of committee, never mind the floor. But fortunately, this year's version, and I did have to address a couple of not opposition per se, but concerns. And so we addressed it like 2 hours before we actually voted on it. And so this year we were able to move it with unanimous vote off the floor. And I'm hoping that means it will move out of the Senate with much less friction. And so the concerns had to do with, of course, pulling in agencies and pulling in such as auto dealerships, definitely the scrap metal dealers, people who were buying them, legitimately. And then because we kind of addressed where we could kind of pinch down on the unattached, untraceable ones 2 years ago. So the problem really was on how to make it work well. And then I think there were some worries about creating new crimes. And so I kept our Public Safety Committee chair, I call him my advisor on this bill all the way through. And his opinion was that when we right size it and when we do it at the right point, and in this case, we are trying to get to the consolidators or the fencers or the aggregators, people who are sending out messages through electronic means. Hey, we're here, we've got the cash, bring your catalytic converters in. And when people are showing up with multiple, that they are not from their own vehicles, they're from other people's. And unfortunately, it's a way for consumers to be victimized, and it's very expensive, even if the people who are stealing them might not net that much money. It is very expensive for the car owner and very inconvenient. And so Representative Roger Goodman was of the opinion that the way we have structured it, 7 or more, the penalty is pretty harsh. And so they would be detached catalytic converters that are not marked with the VIN number or parts of the VIN number, and they can't document where they got them. Then we know that they are trafficking in them. And so that will give a really good tool to the law enforcement to be able to, and hopefully it's not only trying to find the owners of those catalytic converters, because by then the damage is done, but more to convince people to not be in that business, that line of business. And so I'm hoping that the worries will be addressed by showing that we are reducing the volume of that illegal activity.
Great. Thank you so much, Rep. Ryu. Our next question, I'm going to put it up on the screen. So please give some specific examples of how you are and have worked across the aisle.
Representative Davis?
Sure, I can start. This is an area something I'm really proud of. So some of my very best friends in Olympia are Republicans in the House, in the Senate, people I came in with. And virtually every bill that I've ever introduced, with very, very few exceptions, has been bipartisan. And that's really important to me for a lot of reasons. And they have not all been non-controversial measures. A couple examples: I had a very large omnibus bill last year related to domestic violence, and there were probably 25 provisions in the bill, but about a half a dozen of those provisions related to increased firearm restrictions for individuals found culpable of domestic violence. And I worked incredibly closely. I got two of my dear friends, Republicans on the House Community Safety Committee, co-sponsored that bill with me. And that bill passed the House 91-7 and passed the Senate 42-7. And it was a gun bill. And, this year I worked very closely with a Republican who's a former recently retired firefighter, and then a Republican who is a retired law enforcement officer on my first responder wellness bill. They both gave beautiful floor speeches, and I think it's incredibly important. Working with my colleagues across the aisle is incredibly important, and frankly, I think produces better policy.
I think we are starting to call you the Republican whisperer, Representative Davis. So the way I've found a good way to work with across the aisle, of course, when I would like their help on my own bills, but also especially when I see bills that Republican members have introduced that I am either chairing or hearing the bill, or I'm serving on one of the two other committees, and I have some interest in it, then I offer and reach out to them and ask key questions such as, have you thought about how the bill would be implemented? Because you have to think about how, not only how to pass the bill, but will the implementation be really doing what they thought the problem solving of that bill, the goal of that bill. And sometimes they have brilliant ideas, but they really don't know how to put legs on it. And I even tell my husband, I'm really good at putting legs on your creative ideas, honey. And so, and by the way, happy Valentine's Day. So I enjoy doing that for the bills, especially for the bills coming to my own committee, but also making even other people's bills better. And I think that's exactly what Representative Davis is talking about, of reaching out across the aisle. Because we get diverse perspectives, and many of them are from Eastern Washington and of course Southwest Washington. And so I think the more we have different perspectives on my bills or their bills, I think we come up with much better policies. So I do, sometimes, of course, we will agree to disagree, but many times we actually do pass bills almost unanimously or unanimously.
Great. Thank you so much for your responses. Just as a reminder, you're watching a live virtual town hall with your 32nd district representatives, and you can submit questions in the comments section. We're now going to go to a question on education funding. So what is the state legislature doing to address the huge funding crisis facing K-12 public education in the state?
So I can start. So we have, the legislature, unlike the federal government, has to have a balanced budget. We're not allowed to be in debt. And so what we have to work with resource-wise is what the economic and revenue forecast, which actually just came out today, and revenues were slightly up, but we're given kind of a box or constraints to draw within. And what that amounts to is we have about $1.2 billion over the 3-year period, the current fiscal year, the second year of the biennium, and then what's called the Outlook biennium, which is the next 2 years. And we will end up spending a little bit less than half of that funding on education. But one of the things to keep in mind is that education funding is, as I'm sure the asker of the question knows, there's kind of multiple different subcomponents. There's something called MSOC, which is the sort of the most flexible funding, the materials, supplies, and operating costs funding for districts. There's also, there was a bill about funding for paraeducators specifically. There's been lots of conversations and legislation related to special education. We have an artificial cap that we will only pay for special education services if 13.5% or less of the students in your school district are in special education. And of the 295 school districts, about 80 to 100 of those districts have north of 15% of their students in special ed. And so right sizing that would be about 110 million. We have a bill, again, with the materials, supplies, and operating costs looking at approximately 150 million. There's funding for the School Employees Benefit Board, or SEB. So, and that is increase as well. There's also funding for school meals. And so if you're adding up sort of all of these pieces together, that's what we're looking at. And unfortunately, it's inadequate. I mean, we've heard from the district about, music programs being cut, and it's just awful. And what we really ultimately need to do is find a sustainable long-term revenue source. So we're not doing this sort of whack-a-mole trying to plug the hole in the dike. But unfortunately, this session, that's what you're going to see, is this attempt to try to stop the bleed where possible.
Absolutely. It was very difficult for us to see those huge gaps in funding and certain policies that could have helped, but then it would have created other inequities. And so there were some hard votes hard, I guess, discussions that we had to have. And I'm hoping that we will have a more robust budget year next year. And in the meantime, I mean, there was even one amendment we had to do where instead of just starting a new small but new funding or increased funding in July, how about we start it in June, just so that the school districts can have that stopgap measure of just even 1 month. And so we're trying really hard with limited revenues, literally, to make it to keep schools from closing and having to close down programs that we know are really good for the kids. So
great.
The next.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Thank you so much for those responses. The next question is about ranked choice voting. Let me put it up on the screen. Can you please make ranked choice voting a standard in Washington state? I hope it combats extremism that is challenging our democracy.
I agree, and I've been supporting ranked choice voting for many, many years. And each time the bills are introduced, I ask that it be as simple as possible, because I know a state like Alaska that enacted it, and we have to change our laws in order to adopt it. We can't just have the Secretary of State just adopt it. And I know they had to overcome a lot of I guess confusion is the best way to describe it, but I think it does work, and I think it is much more democratic with a small d, and I'm sure Alaska will work through their confusions, and so I'm hoping that we can adopt ranked choice voting at all levels of government sooner rather than later.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is a live question from the comments. All right. Judith says mail-in ballots are not accessible to the visually impaired. 5 states allow electronic ballot submission. The Washington Council of the Blind is looking for support for this issue. Can we have your support?
I would love to learn more about this. I've never served on the state government committee before, which kind of oversees elections. But I, by all means, I think the caucus that Rep. Ryu and I serve in, the House Democratic Caucus, is incredibly concerned about equity, and we define equity broadly, and that certainly includes individuals living with disabilities, individuals who are visually impaired or hearing impaired, and I think it would be incredibly important and well received if we had a solution that we could propose to address that issues, because we've passed all sorts of policies to try to increase access to the ballot and increase voter participation, and we certainly don't want to leave anybody out. So would welcome a conversation about that over the interim.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we were 100% mail-in ballot, I remember ballot chasing and even calling people, hey, it's voting day today, come and find us and cast your paper ballot. And then I'm sure everybody remembers the hanging chads and so on in other states that were an issue. And so we want to make sure that we have a paper trail, and which we do. I understand that ours is very robust, documented. And so, and I know that when they were provisional ballots needed, and I think that's going on right now too, that we can, I think we could even email our ballots in, and of course they would have to double check it and so on. But within those 3 weeks or so, they can be done in different ways. And so, as with Representative Davis, I'd love to figure out how to do that.
Great. Thank you both so much. Our next question is about the CCA, I believe. So Cap and Invest sounds good and has certainly brought in money for the state. However, please tell us how much this program has resulted in actual CO2 reduction.
Sure, so I can start on that one. So just for anyone who may not be familiar, the Cap and Invest is the Climate Commitment Act, as it's known, and that essentially gave the state resources to make a myriad of investments with the intent of addressing climate change broadly, but specific to CO2 emissions. We know that among the largest contributors to CO2 emissions is the transportation sector. And so the Climate Commitment Act directly invested $120 million in programs to help clean up some of the dirtiest vehicles on the road. So gas-fueled trucks, buses, delivery vans. We even had legislation this year about zero-emission school buses, actually, that Rep. Ryu and I had before the House Appropriations Committee. There was also a specific focus on overburdened communities and making sure we have an equity lens as it relates to CO2 emissions specific to our overburdened communities, often communities of color, communities near airports, things of that nature. Additionally, there were investments in things like multimodal transportation, so investments in buses and light rail and walking, to try to, again, all related to recognizing that so much of the CO2 is a derivative of the transportation sector. And then finally, there was a $80 million investment to help low and moderate income households transition off of fossil fuels so that they can adopt heat pumps so that they're using the most efficacious and climate-friendly methods to heat and cool their homes.
And one of the, I guess, issues about electric school buses, for instance, were about range of the buses, especially in cold climate and so on. And as you all know, the electric vehicles, their mileages have gone up quite a bit. The range has increased. So instead of being limited to being able to run 80 miles on a single charge, I think some vehicles are able to go for 200-300 miles now. And so I think as industries are working on improving battery life and range, I think we will be able to invest a lot more, and especially in electrification of our transportation sector, that will help quite a bit. And as you know, diesel fume, as I found out when I was pregnant, is not just CO2. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in that is very damaging, especially to young lungs. And so we had a robust discussion about electrifying our school buses, as well as, of course, the rest of the transportation sector as much as possible. I believe it's about 40% of the climate impact that are transportation, and of course our buildings and so on, and industries too. So definitely I supported CCA, and I'll continue to do so, and I'm sure we will be using the proceeds very well.
Great. Thank you both so much. Just as a reminder, you're watching a live virtual town hall with your 32nd district representatives, and you can submit questions in the comment section. We're going to go to another question that was actually submitted live to one of our other pages that we're sharing out to. So they say, I'm concerned about car prowlers in the shoreline area. What steps are you taking to address local crime?
I'm happy to start on that one, just serving on the Community Safety Committee, and both Rep. Ryu and I live in Shoreline. So the first thing I'll say is we are at a crisis point with law enforcement staffing levels. I cannot underscore this enough. Even prior to a huge loss of law enforcement officers over the last several years, even prior to that, for years, Washington State has had the lowest number of law enforcement officers per capita in the entire country. So that was our starting place. We lost a lot of law enforcement officers. Just today, I was speaking at the Walk Cops event, which is the Washington Council for Police and Sheriffs. And I met a police sergeant from Pierce County who told me that the other night, Pierce County is the second largest county in the state. The other night, he was the only sergeant for the entire county on duty. And what is happening as a direct derivative of a lack of law enforcement is triage. And so we're not seeing law enforcement able to, they can't do two things. They're not able to do some of the proactive policing, so the more kind of preventative work and more engagement with community in terms of crime prevention and proactive policing. They're also not, they're having to triage calls, and also for things like detective resources. So that is very real. There was legislation that would have allowed a sales tax increase for the purpose of allocating to hiring law enforcement. That bill did not advance. There is a bill that we did hear in the House Community Safety Committee today related to flexible work schedules. And the hope is that that will actually help, in addition to increasing the number of law enforcement officers overall, that will specifically help increase the number of women in the profession of law enforcement. There's an initiative called 30 by 30 to try to have 30% of the police workforce be women by 2030. So, but we really need to focus on recruitment and retention for that profession. And I will just say, the first thing I'll say is our Shoreline Police Department is fantastic. I work with them a lot and have just been incredibly impressed. They deal with the most horrible things that human beings do to themselves and to one another. And their professionalism and their integrity is unmatched. And I think the more that people can tell them that and thank our law enforcement officers for the incredibly difficult job that they do, that profession collectively has felt very demoralized. And that while it's really hard to legislate demoralization, really the way to do that is just those individual interactions. And we're not going to be able to recruit people back to the profession. And we're certainly not going to be able to recruit the type of people we want in the profession of law enforcement until we can create a situation where there's that mutual trust between community and law enforcement, and law enforcement feel valued and respected again. So I do think there's a way that each of us can contribute to that. Additionally, just as it relates to car prowlers and property crime, I can't help but mention the myriad investments we've made in behavioral health. So we have made major investments in a program called the Recovery Navigator Program, which has newly come to Shoreline, which is for individuals whose criminogenic behavior is rooted in untreated mental health or addiction challenges. And it is an intensive case management program that's highly effective at reducing recidivism and addresses the root cause of that behavior so that they're not continuing to prowl cars. It's basically modeled after the LEAD program, which is law enforcement assisted diversion.
Great. Thank you so much for that response. So our next question is about the initiatives. So why aren't hearings being held for the initiatives that have been found to have necessary signatures?
I can start jumping on that. So one of them is perhaps a practical reason. So just so folks know, when initiatives come to the legislature can do a couple things. We can, if we do nothing, which is sometimes the case, the initiative will go to the people. The legislature can also hold a hearing, and the legislature can propose an alternative to an initiative, which also sometimes happens. So voters have a choice of what was originally proposed and what the legislature proposes in response. Part of it is just truly a practical matter. So this is a short legislative session of only 60 days, and bills just flip-flop. So all the House bills went to the Senate, and the Senate bills to the House, and a number of bills are dying, not because of lack of merit, but truly because of lack of time. The receiving chamber has sometimes only 2 hearings to both have the public hearing and then exec, which means to vote bills out. And so since the ballot initiatives would go to the people anyways, and there's an incredible amount of interest and energy around them, a hearing would be very involved. And so that's one sort of a practical reason. Another reason would be, in some cases, perhaps the legislature is not intending to posit an alternative, and so it's going to end up going to the ballot anyway. So that would be another reason.
And the initiatives are not subject to deadlines like every other bill that we introduce are. And so we have time. I mean, it doesn't feel like we have time, but we literally can, if we decide to hear them, we can by March the 7th, but I'm sure we won't wait until the last day.
Great. Thank you both so much for your responses. Our next question is on rent stabilization. So what is the status of legislation to control rent increases? The rent for my apartment has increased 75% since new owners bought the building 3 years ago.
Yes, 2114. We literally voted on it. Was it only yesterday? Or yeah, it feels like a long time ago, but it passed with my vote and Representative Davis's vote. We ended up voting for it twice because we considered it in appropriations as well. And the way it arrived in appropriations, I was not happy with it. And so since I had many conversations with both the prime sponsor as well as Representative Macri, who had introduced it originally several years ago, I did advocate for certain improvements, and they actually took them. And so I was able to vote for it both out of appropriations and off of the floor. So it is over in the Senate now. As to what the Senate does with it, we don't know.
Yeah, I'll just say I'm one of the only renters in the whole legislature. I think there's 4 of us out of 147. And my landlord also told me she was going to massively increase my rent. And I am what's called a rent burdened or cost burdened renter. My rent is over half of my annual legislative salary. So that bill really resonates with me personally, and I was really proud of the work we did to get it passed to the Senate.
Great. Thank you both so much. Our next question is, how will you vote for House Bill 2049?
Yeah, I actually co-sponsored it with Representative Berry. So if it were to have come to the floor, I would definitely have voted for it. And this is the producer responsibility for streams of solid waste. But I believe, Representative Davis, you voted for it out of appropriations,
Correct.
Right?
Yes, I'm also very supportive.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you both so much. We're now going to go to a live question. This is from a Kitsap resident. They say, both of you supported House Bill 2469, which is why they're here on this call, and you should be proud of it. They'd love to hear why it's not passing. Joel's Law has to be amended.
Great question, and thank you so much for being here. So that's legislation that I introduced that Rep. Ryu co-sponsored related to the Involuntary Treatment Act or civil commitment, and it addressed a number of issues, including expanding petitioners under Joel's Law, which is when an individual can try to have a court overturn the decision of a designated crisis responder not to detain a person, or if a designated crisis responder has been summoned to evaluate a person in crisis and 48 hours have passed and no DCR has arrived, a Joel's Law petition can be initiated as well. That bill also contained important provisions related to training for emergency department staff, related to when to summon a designated crisis responder, who are the only profession in the entire state who have the legal authority to detain somebody involuntarily for psychiatric or substance use disorder related needs. Unfortunately, the chair of that committee, the Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee in the House, elected not to advance that bill for reasons that remain unclear to me. It's incredibly important for public safety. It's incredibly important for the quality of life of these individuals who are suffering profoundly and their families, and I intend to work on it over the interim and would welcome the person who asked the question to contact my office.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, let me go back over here to find it. I believe it is about those who are over the age of 70. So what do you see are the issues for seniors 70 and above in getting employment?
Yeah, I am not quite there, but I'm getting there year by year. I believe that because of the workforce shortage that we're facing right now, especially with what we are calling the silver tsunami of experienced workers retiring, especially during and after the pandemic. Well, I think we're still in the pandemic, but we definitely have workforce shortages. And so we actually are working on incentives to have certain career state employees stay on the job longer. Obviously, until younger new workers come on board. Definitely with the changes that are happening in the labor and in the industry, especially with AI, retooling is going to be necessary for everyone, and also for the older worker. And so if we're willing to be getting retooled or retrained or upgraded, I guess, then I think being able to keep and find a job gives us a sense of purpose and also helps with our personal and family economic well-being. And then also, as we get older, our expenses go up significantly, such as for long-term care. And so I think it is good for people who are willing to and able to work beyond 70 to stay in the workforce.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is about taxes. How can we stop the continuous approval of new taxes, fees, and expenses, that many of us cannot afford? The emphasis should be on how we can better maximize the benefits of our current expenditures by cutting or reducing programs that cannot produce measurable results that are proportional to their expense.
So a couple thoughts on that. The first thing that comes to mind is not necessarily the fundamental issue in my mind is not necessarily if it's new taxes or not, but rather the source of the taxes. So the state government has three primary sources of taxes: sales tax, which is incredibly regressive and impacts our lowest income individuals the most; property tax, which disproportionately impacts our senior citizens, individuals on fixed incomes; and then we have the business and occupations tax, which is also flawed in its own way because it taxes gross receipts rather than profit. Our tax structure is deeply flawed. There's actually been a tax structure work group for years, but ultimately looking at taxes like an income tax or a wealth tax that would really right size. The reason this question is being asked, not just by this individual, but by so many people, is because the people who are getting squeezed are the lower income folks and middle income folks. That's who's getting squeezed by our current tax structure. And it's the wealthy and the ultra wealthy who are benefiting. And so until we kind of right size our tax code, us being the most progressive tax state in the entire country, an unfortunate distinction, I think we're going to continue to struggle with this. But on the other hand, currently we only have these very limited taxation tools, and the needs are extraordinary. At the same time, constituents don't want new taxes, which I completely understand. But constituents also want us to address homelessness and the K-12 education gap. And we hear from incredibly compelling stories. Just one example, the bill didn't pass this year because it was too expensive, but there was a bill about if you have an adult child over the age of 18 who has severe medical needs or developmental disabilities and you serve as their caregiver, you can get compensated by the state for that. But if you have a child under the age of 18 who has severe medical needs or developmental disabilities, who may even require 24/7 care, and the parent is the caregiver, there's no compensation. And yet that parent is incapable of working because their child has such severe and profound needs. That is an advocacy group that's keenly interested. I saw a question in the chat about the prototypical school model, which has to do with how many nurses and teachers and paraeducators you have in a school building. What we're doing is inadequate, and we just don't have enough resources. And so that's why questions like new taxes crop up. But the real question we should be asking is what type of taxes and from who is most burdened by those taxes.
Absolutely. So it's the fairness of the taxes, as well as who can bear to pay those taxes, who can afford to pay those taxes. And we're not there at all.
Great. Thank you so much. We're actually going to go to another question about taxes. This one is live from Ruth. Ruth asks, why didn't capital gains tax result in net gains to education in the governor's budget? That should be education money.
Sure. So the capital gains tax money is actually, in fact, education money. I think sometimes the way state budgets are released, they're a little difficult to discern. But statutorily, as in state law, it is required that the first $500 million from the capital gains tax goes to fund it's the Education Legacy Trust Fund, but specifically that money was earmarked for childcare and early learning programs. And it was the Fair Start for Kids Act that sort of accompanied that. And the capital gains tax, the first $500 million, provides the funding for that. And then investments or revenue that are north of that first $500 million go into something called SCAP, which is the School Construction Assistance Program. So physical plant structures, building schools. And we have many school buildings that are incredibly dilapidated, some of them even in tsunami zones on the coast. And so all of that funding did, in fact, go to education. It's just, unfortunately, an inadequate sum.
Great. Thank you so much. We're now going to go to a question. I believe it was submitted by the Linwood Times. Are there any bills that either of you are particularly proud of this year?
So, of course, the catalytic converter bill, I'm really glad that it moved unanimously over to the Senate. But I think I'm really proud of my committee members and others who are not sitting on the committee that introduced about disaster preparedness and resiliency, because as you saw from the Lahaina or Maui fires, as well as what happened in the Spokane Valley end of last year, I guess fall of last year, those wildfire conflagrations are absolutely devastating. People lose their homes, lose lives. Sorry, my light keeps going off, so I have to wave at it. We're trying to conserve energy here in the building. So there were several bills that we were able to introduce and move that addresses, of course, the immediate problem of what if there's a wildfire or some sort of a devastating loss, then who is there to even give them technical support? how can they access either federal or state funds. So small steps, but I think, in my opinion, very meaningful. For instance, one was setting up a public grant funding for those that do not rise to FEMA level of disasters, because for every 10 disaster that does not, for every disaster that rises to FEMA level, 10 of them don't rise to that level. So it's either the local government or the state that has to step in, or the people who are suffering from those disasters have to somehow find their ways out of it and rebuild their homes. So we're even looking at long-term goals of, can we change our building code so that not only just to build to save people's lives by preventing it from caving in on them, but also so that we can immediately occupy certain buildings so we can have a base of operation as well as a shelter. So I'm really proud of members of both Democratic and Republican members who have been working well together to think way ahead as well as deal with immediate problems that we have right now.
Yeah, I think actually what I'll mention, since I talked about bills at the beginning, is actually some budget provisos that I submitted that I'm hoping will be in the House budget that I think are really important. So they're not as visible because they're not bills, but I submitted a budget proviso related to domestic violence intervention treatment, which is also known as perpetrator treatment. It's not something that's funded by insurance, but domestic violence is a serial behavior, and it's really important that we have evidence-based interventions for these folks so we can actually intervene and try to stop the violence and interrupt that cycle, rather than the person just going on to re-victimize or going on to another victim. It's not something that's been well studied or well invested in. I also had a number of budget provisos, about 12 actually, related to addressing substance use disorder and the fentanyl crisis. One of the modalities that I'm most interested in is a program for rapid induction on buprenorphine, which is Suboxone, or methadone. Both of those are medications that are used to treat opioid use disorder, and they're highly effective. And it turns out that a lot of individuals are not doing well inducing or starting on those medications in an outpatient setting. But the Swedish hospital on First Hill actually piloted the concept of bringing people into the hospital, and they can get people up to what's called a therapeutic dose of methadone or buprenorphine in as short as 3 days, and then discharge them fully stable with no more withdrawal symptoms, and really set them up at a better chance of success. So I had a budget proviso around that. Budget proviso to expand our program for medications for opioid use disorders, those same medications offered in jails. About half of all Washingtonians who have opioid use disorder will end up in one of our 58 jails in any given 12-month period. And so trying to intervene there. And also submitted a budget proviso related to peers, so people who are in recovery from behavioral health challenges working in emergency departments. So being matched with people who present in psychiatric crisis, suicidal crisis, addiction crisis, and helping them not just in the moment, but also upon discharge, helping them actually follow up and engage in the follow-up care that was recommended by the emergency department, with the hope that that will A, set them on the road to recovery, and B, prevent a readmission to the hospital.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think we have time for one final question. Funnily enough, they also put one last question in their question here. So one last question: any appropriations for projects or programs for Linwood and Edmonds?
Yes, I have submitted, and I'm hoping that we get funded for about $400,000 for the Linwood Convention Center. As you know, it's at the corner where I-5 and 405 meets, or just about. And also we will have the light rail stations opening there later this year, and that would be the fourth of the 4 light rail stations at the north end, all in the 32nd Legislative District, 2 in Shoreline, 1 in Montlake Terrace, and 1 in Linwood. And so the Linwood Convention Center would like to work on their 13 acres that they own there as a public district, facilities district. And they asked for some planning money, and the planning part of it, it does get very expensive, about $4 million. So in a much more robust, better budget year, we could ask for 25%, but I think we'll be very lucky to get 10% of that $4 million that we will need. So that should be good for that area. It will take quite a few years because it's a multi-million-dollar project, but I think we will be proud of it once it gets built out.
Great. Thank you so much. So that was our last question of the evening. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. I'm now going to turn it back over to Rep. Ryu for some closing remarks. Rep. Ryu, would you like to begin?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so very much. So I guess I just wanted to give you a kind of a vision of what I'll be working on, but also excitement that's building. One of the things that I've been working on is responsible outdoor recreation. I think I briefly mentioned it, that the state parks is looking to diversify their workforce as well as, of course, leadership. So as you know, 2026 FIFA World Cup is coming to Seattle. And of course, Vancouver also is holding some games. So that traffic between June and July of 2026 will be exciting, but also will need a lot of pre-planning and coordination with Vancouver, BC folks. So we are actually I'm working with Representative Cortez from Everett, and he actually knows the people at the organizing committee. So do look them up, and I think there are opportunities to volunteer, hopefully, and maybe even ask if get on a list of some sort. I have no idea how long the list is, to be interested in any tickets and so on. As you've heard, AI issues and policies, especially states' use of AI, is a huge talking point. And so look forward to getting a lot more deeply into that. And then I mentioned my committee's work on disaster preparedness, recovery, and resiliency. And very exciting. We were talking about octopus farming, which we are going to ban, I think. But I am looking forward to working with some senators on aquaculture of kelp farming, which is seaweeds. And I think that will be good for the food chain, but also for the environment. So looking forward to the interim. Representative Davis?
Sure. I'll just say that, I think a lot of folks know I work primarily on issues related to behavioral health, mental health, addiction services, and issues related to public safety, whether that's criminal legal system reform or diversion options, addressing increasing crime, issues related to law enforcement. But my actual job is to be interested in what you're interested in and to represent your interests here in the legislature. So I just want to let folks know this is a very long interim. We leave we leave the Marble Castle in Olympia on March 7th and don't return until the following January. And Rep. Ryu and I both live in Shoreline. We're home, and we're just really encouraged. Oh, my lights also went out. Come back. But I would really encourage folks just to please reach out to us. And I would love to have coffee. Would love to hear what bills and folks are interested in, what needs that you see in our community. That would mean a lot to me. So I look forward to that. And sorry for going dark. Yes, we are saving energy and fossil fuels here.
Thank you both so much. So that's all the time that we have this evening. Thank you so much for attending and for submitting questions. If we did not get to your question, you can directly contact Rep. Ryu and Rep. Davis's offices with your comments. Their contact information will be on the screen shortly. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great evening.